Everyone ignore a black maid's baby crying non-stop, until Billionaire held her and what he saw. It all began with a cry, sharp, unrelenting, echoing through marble halls like an alarm no one could silence. That Thursday afternoon should have been as quiet and composed as every other at the Blackwell estate. The floors gleamed, the staff moved like shadows, and the solemn hush gave the place the reverence of a church stripped of prayer. But the cry tore through it all. A baby's cry, piercing, persistent, rising from the arms of a young woman in a faded uniform, Emma, the new maid. Her cheeks were flushed, her arms trembling, and her eyes held the raw, pleading look of someone on the edge of surrender. She had begged for only one thing that morning. Please let me bring her today. Just today. She won't make a sound. But the only thing anyone could hear now was that sound. A server fumbled a stack of files. Someone dropped a silver tray. The air was thick with tension, dense enough to touch. Then came another sound, the heavy groan of the main office door opening upstairs. Avery Blackwell stepped out. He was a man built of discipline, habit, and control. The kind of man who could quiet a room by simply existing in it. Clad in a charcoal suit, as flawless as if he were headed into a board meeting, he stood at the top of the grand staircase, his gaze ice-cold as it swept the scene below. Emma clutched her daughter tighter, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. This was it. She would lose the job she so desperately needed, and the child she had tried so hard to keep silent would be the reason why. But then something happened no one could have predicted. Avery began to descend, not in anger, not with reproach. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as if weighing every inch of his approach. When he reached Emma, he said nothing. He simply extended his hand. Emma froze. But as she trembled and passed her child into the arms of the coldest man she had ever met, the crying stopped. Instantly, the room sank into a hush so complete it felt haunted. And what happened next changed everything. The child looked directly into Avery's eyes, and in her small, chubby hand was a silver chain. Dangling, glinting in the light, was a worn pendant. An object Avery had not seen in 2 years, one he believed buried with the woman who once wore it. The engraving on the tarnished metal seemed to sear itself into his mind. B.M. This child, in a way no one could yet explain, was the daughter of Benjamin Moore, and Benjamin had died in the car Avery was driving. If you're still with us, thank you for walking alongside us through the deeply emotional first chapter of this story. And you know, this is only the beginning. There are still secrets yet to surface, unnamed sorrows waiting to be understood, and an entire journey of healing unfolding just ahead. If this story has left you in quiet reflection or stirred something within your heart, we would love to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment to let us know where in the world this story has reached. And if you'd like to continue receiving heartfelt stories like this one each day, don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, click the like button, and share this video with someone you believe could use a little warmth in the midst of life's busy rush. Now, we invite you to take the next step with us into part 2 of this story. What lies beyond that cry just might hold you in its grip. Avery stood motionless in the vast corridor, holding the little girl against his chest, as if holding something more sacred than life itself. His gaze never left the silver bracelet glinting on the child's wrist. The chain was worn, the metal face scratched with time, but the engraving remained clear. 3 letters. B.M. This was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It was the very thing Benjamin Moore, his dearest friend, had worn for nearly 20 years. Benjamin once joked that even if the world collapsed around him, he'd still hold on to that bracelet. It had been a gift from his mother, the woman who raised him alone and who always told him that the most important things in life should be kept close to the heart. Avery knew this. He had only ever seen Benjamin remove it once, and that was the day they stood together, grieving the loss of her. The bracelet, once swinging freely from the wrist of the man Avery had loved like a brother, now lay still on the arm of a child who could not yet speak. It couldn't be. His head spun, hands trembling slightly. The girl continued to stare up at him, her dark eyes wide and deep, pulling him back to years long gone. Years when Benjamin's laughter still echoed in boardrooms and across golf courses, and in the quiet hours of the night when two aging men sat together and spoke of life and dreams they rarely voiced aloud. Avery swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice as he looked toward Emma, the young woman still standing silent, her arms limp at her sides, her eyes full of worry. "Whose child is she?" The words came low, but each syllable dropped like stone. Emma pressed her lips together, voice quivering. "Grace. Her name is Grace Moore." Moore. The name ripped through Avery's chest again. Benjamin Moore. Emma looked down. He was her father. I don't know how to explain. I didn't think we'd ever cross paths again. I needed work. I wasn't going to tell anyone. But I couldn't hide that bracelet. It was his. Avery turned away, eyes drifting toward the large window where the afternoon sun was beginning to fade. All around him, the world fell into a muffled hush. He could hear the wind whistling faintly, the soft footsteps of staff retreating into the distance, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding louder than it had in years. All his life, he had never believed in signs, never in fate. But in that moment, with a stranger's child resting quietly in his arms and carrying the keepsake of a man long buried, Avery understood that the universe was saying something he could no longer ignore. His mind reeled back to that night. The storm, pouring rain, slick roads. Benjamin sitting beside him, speaking of leaving the company, moving to a small coastal town, starting over with a woman named Emma. Avery had barely listened, his thoughts consumed with a new contract and a business trip that couldn't wait. Then the truck came, charging out of the darkness, headlights slicing through the storm like a final flash of lightning. Avery survived. Benjamin didn't. People called it luck. But Avery knew that from that moment on, every breath he drew had become a silent sentence he carried in his chest. And now, in the center of a grand hall, where everything was cold and precise, life had found its way back to him in the form of a child with her father's eyes. He leaned down, gently brushing a fine wisp of hair from Grace's forehead. She kept her gaze fixed on him, clear and unflinching, like a mirror showing him everything he had been and everything he had refused to face. The old pain rose, sharp and familiar, but alongside it came something else, something strange and long forgotten. Life, hope, and a chance. A second chance that, perhaps this time, he would not let slip away. Emma said nothing more. She stood still, hands tightly clasped, her gaze avoiding the one that had shifted in Avery, grown quieter, deeper, and harder to read. It wasn't fear that held her back. It was knowing that once the truth was spoken aloud, there would be no returning to what was before. Grace sat quietly in the arms of that powerful man, as if she had always belonged there. No tears, no restless fidgeting, only a calm so complete it unsettled even Emma, who had rarely seen such stillness in her daughter. She understood that this moment was a turning point. She just didn't know where it would lead. At last, Avery broke the silence. "Where did you meet Benjamin?" His voice no longer carried the frost it once had, but the weight of authority remained unmistakable. Emma lifted her head and, for the first time, dared to meet his eyes. "At a community clinic in North Charleston," she said softly. "I worked the night shift cleaning offices. He would come late, usually after the accounting floor had shut down. We started with a few minutes of conversation each night, then quick coffee breaks, then it became 8 months. He never spoke about money or his wealthy friends." She paused, took a breath. "We were just two tired people trying to find a little gentleness in a world that gave none. When I found out I was pregnant, I never got the chance to tell him. The accident happened before I could." Avery said nothing. The details matched too well with what he remembered. In those final months, Benjamin had changed. He showed up less often. He smiled in a way Avery hadn't seen before, softer somehow, distant. At the time, Avery assumed his friend was shirking responsibilities. He had no idea that was the season in which Benjamin had, perhaps for the first time, truly begun to live. Emma grew uneasy at Avery's silence. She felt she had to speak again, not to justify herself, but to give shape to a truth she hadn't fully allowed herself to believe. I don't expect you to trust me right away. I didn't come here to reclaim the past or ask for anything. I just needed steady work to raise my daughter. That's all I was thinking about when I knocked on your door." In that moment, Avery saw something in her. Not a woman hiding secrets, but one who had been hiding herself for far too long, out of fear. Fear that if the truth slipped out, every door would close again just as they had so many times before. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror on sleepless nights when the guilt of the accident wrapped around him like a chain. And then it struck him perhaps they were both carrying a quiet darkness no one wanted to name. But it was the child, this small, silent bridge between them, who had drawn them into each other's orbit, not by blood, but by a shared loss that had never healed. Benjamin's name hovered between them now. Neither spoke it again, but neither could escape its presence. That name, uttered only minutes ago, had thickened the air between them, as if the past had been summoned back into the room, stepped through the front door, and sat down quietly between two people clinging to the present with everything they had left. Avery still held Grace in his arms, though by now he had stopped noticing the weight of the child. Every sense in him had turned inward, toward memory, toward the fragments of a friendship he once believed unbreakable. And the tragedy he had never forgiven himself for. Benjamin was never the kind of man people grew close to easily, but once someone found their way into his world, they stayed. His humor was gentle, his intellect sharp, never boastful. Avery first met Benjamin at a financial conference when they were both still young, full of ambition, and far from the men they would become. A brief exchange after the keynote turned into dinner, and from there, a friendship that lasted more than 2 decades. Benjamin was the only one who dared to speak the truth to Avery when he was wrong, and the first to stand beside him when everything fell apart. Avery had imagined they would grow old together, start a charitable foundation, and one day sit on a shaded porch, playing chess on quiet afternoons in their final years. But the accident swept all of that away. Emma remained where she was, quietly watching the shifting expressions on Avery's face, as if she too was trying to decipher what was being held in the stillness between them. And finally, it was she who broke the silence. "I didn't know you were his close friend." "Benjamin. He didn't talk much about his past or his work. I think it was his way of protecting me from the complexity of the world he came from." Her voice softened. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was going to reach out. But then I heard about the accident, and after that, the article." She didn't finish the sentence, but Avery understood. He remembered that time with painful clarity, the image of the wrecked car, the headline in bold type. His name printed beside the word loss. They called it a tragedy. The driver survived. The man in the passenger seat did not. No one ever knew the truth of that night. Avery gently tightened his hold around Grace, as if to steady not just her, but himself. He looked at Emma then, really looked at her, not as an employee, not as a stranger, but as the last person who still carried a thread that bound him to Benjamin. "Did he love you?" The question came without accusation, only with the need to understand. Emma nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. "I believe he did. Ours wasn't a loud kind of love. There weren't many promises, but in his eyes I saw something true. And the last time he placed his hand on my belly, he smiled. That smile told me he was ready." Avery turned away. He needed air, needed space to let it all settle. But in his chest, the name Benjamin no longer belonged only to the past. It was rising again, clear and undeniable, in the form of a child, and the story of a woman who might bring salvation, or perhaps another storm. But one thing he now understood: silence could not last forever. And there are names that, once spoken aloud, never again leave the heart of the one who still lives. The air in the grand hall still held the faint echo of the name that had just been spoken when the sharp sound of high heels broke the silence, echoing from the corridor behind. Victoria Lane appeared with her usual crisp composure, her gaze sweeping swiftly over Emma before settling on Avery, who stood with Grace still in his arms. She didn't need to ask a thing. The way he held that child told her everything had changed since the morning, and she did not like it. "Avery," she said, her voice calm but edged with a firmness sharper than usual. "We need to speak in private." Her eyes flicked toward Emma as if the young woman's presence here was an offense to the decorum of a space meant only for those of stature. Avery didn't turn. Not now. The brief reply made Victoria's brow tighten. She had never heard him speak in that tone, especially not in the presence of strangers. Emma instinctively took a step back, but Avery gently placed his hand on her shoulder, a quiet gesture of reassurance. "It's all right. She stays." Victoria's lip curled slightly, her dissatisfaction plain. "So who is she then?" A woman who suddenly appears with a child and a story that fits too perfectly to be true. And you believe her? Avery turned to face her directly. "That's not for you to judge. I'll find out the truth." "But she and this child, they are connected to Benjamin." Victoria let out a short, dry laugh, but there was something stormy in her eyes, something brittle and barely contained. "So this is all because of Benjamin, still chasing the shadow of a dead man, the one she had long understood she could never replace in Avery's heart." Emma quietly stepped back, pulling Grace closer, an instinctive shield. She wasn't used to these kinds of battles, where words were polished like blades and thrown with grace and precision. She only wanted to do her job, raise her daughter, remain unnoticed, untouched by the currents of a world she didn't belong to. "I don't want to trouble anyone," she said softly, her voice just loud enough for both of them to hear. "I only asked for a job, a chance to support my daughter. I never intended to intrude on anyone's life." Victoria turned to look at her again, and something in her gaze shifted. The disdain softened, replaced by something closer to calculation, maybe even unease. This girl didn't look like someone chasing advantage, and that made her more dangerous. Because sometimes it's the simplest truths that people find hardest to believe. Avery's voice cut through the tension, calm but unwavering. "I will get to the bottom of this, but until then, no one will accuse or dismiss her based on emotion. I won't allow it." Victoria gripped the leather-bound notebook in her hand, then turned, her heels striking the marble once more as she disappeared down the hallway. Only when the sound of her steps had fully faded did Emma finally exhale. She had no idea what awaited her beyond this moment. But she knew one thing with certainty: what she didn't want. She didn't want to live in whispers, beneath suspicious glances, or behind the cold walls of judgment. She didn't want Grace growing up in a place that gleamed on the outside, but hollowed its people with silent condemnation. But for now, there was nowhere else to go. And there was something in Avery's eyes, in the way he looked at Grace, as though he saw a flicker of Benjamin's soul that told her one thing: he would listen. And for someone like Emma, having someone willing to listen was enough for her to stay. The door closed quietly behind Victoria, leaving behind a silence that settled heavily over the vast hall. Avery remained where he was, his gaze fixed on Emma and Grace, as if seeing two figures from a life long lost. Emma still held her daughter close, uncertain whether she should speak, whether she even still belonged in that space. But it was Avery who spoke first, his voice lower now, rougher at the edges, stripped of the cold precision he had used with Victoria. "I never knew Benjamin had someone beside him in those final months. He kept everything to himself. Maybe I never truly asked." He moved toward the large window overlooking the back garden. That place had once been their quiet haven, where he and Benjamin would drink tea after long board meetings, where the biggest decisions of their lives had been made not behind desks or under fluorescent lights, but beneath trees, where birdsong drowned out the weight of the world. It had been a long time since Avery had stepped out there, and now, in the fading afternoon light, it felt as if Benjamin's silhouette still lingered in the corner of the garden, wearing that quiet smile, those knowing eyes that needed no words. Avery turned back, his gaze falling on Grace. She had fallen asleep, her head resting against her mother's shoulder, fingers loosely curled around the edge of Emma's blouse. A strange feeling crept slowly into Avery's chest. Not sorrow, not even tenderness. It was something more elusive. An emptiness so familiar that the sudden return of feeling was jarring. He didn't know what to call it. "I was the one driving that night." His voice came suddenly, startling Emma just slightly. The rain was coming down hard. We were heading back from a conference. Benjamin said he was going to resign, move somewhere quieter. I laughed then, told him he'd never survive the slow life, but I was wrong. There was something in his eyes, like he had finally found what he had been searching for. Emma listened without blinking, absorbing every word like pieces of a puzzle she had never known how to finish. I don't remember much after the crash, Avery continued, just the sound of metal twisting, the smell of smoke, someone shouting my name. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me Benjamin died instantly. People said I was lucky, but I've never felt lucky a single day since. That last sentence escaped his chest like a confession buried too long, rising at last to the surface after years of silence. Emma stepped closer, slowly, her gaze no longer cautious but open, understanding. I used to think, if only I'd come sooner, if only I'd told him about the baby earlier, maybe things would have turned out differently. But I've learned we don't get to choose how the past unfolds, and none of us deserve to carry the weight of guilt forever. Avery looked at her, then at the child. And in that quiet exchange, he saw not just what he had lost, but, for the first time, what might still be preserved. The pain of those left behind is the most invisible, the most enduring. But it is also what proves we are still alive, still able to choose, still capable of doing what is right. Grace stirred slightly, her small hand reaching out into the empty space between them, as if searching for something unseen. Avery reached out instinctively, catching her hand in his, soft, warm. And maybe, in that simple gesture, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. A beginning, not a beginning from scratch, but from the place where everything once fell apart. Night had already settled by the time Avery returned to his upstairs office. Emma and Grace had been shown to a guest room tucked at the back of the estate, the quietest and most private wing of the house. He had told the house manager it was a temporary arrangement, but deep down, he knew nothing was ever truly temporary once a decision had been made in the heart. He sat down slowly, his eyes landing on an old photograph resting against the corner of the desk. It was of him and Benjamin, taken years ago on a windswept beach, both of them younger then, hungry for life, full of ambition. He touched the edge of the frame lightly, as if doing so might bring back the warmth of those days that now existed only in memory. But the silence, barely formed, was quickly shattered. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. A message, unknown number. The words that lit up the screen were short, cold, and sharp as a blade honed for precision. "She's not who you think she is." Beneath it, an attached photo. Emma standing inside a small supermarket not far from the estate, holding a package of diapers, her expression tired, unaware she was being photographed from afar. Avery stared at the image, his heart beginning to race, not because of what he saw, but because of what he didn't know. Who sent this? Why was someone following her, and why send it to him? The second message arrived moments later. A scanned document. He opened it with a tap, a court file. The name at the top made his blood run cold, Emma Rose Carter. Below that, the details were spelled out in unforgiving lines, convicted of financial fraud. A trial held nearly 4 years ago. He read it slowly, each line like a stone settling in his chest. A young woman working at a convenience store, falsified return slips, helped someone exploit the system, was caught, sentenced to 12 months in a semi-custodial rehabilitation program, released, vanished from public record. Avery leaned back in his chair, hand over his brow. Everything he had just begun to piece together now felt suddenly off-kilter. He remembered the look in Emma's eyes when she spoke about Benjamin, the tremble in her voice that didn't feel performed. And more than anything, he remembered Grace, remembered the small hand that had fit so perfectly in his own, like a puzzle piece he hadn't known was missing. But facts were facts, and the past, however long buried, never erased itself. The questions began to stir in his mind, dark silhouettes dancing in the shadows of doubt. Had Emma orchestrated this from the beginning? Had she known who he was all along, known about Benjamin, known about the wealth, the estate? And Grace, was she truly Benjamin's child, or just a convenient story told to open a door? Avery stood and crossed to the window. Down below, a soft light flickered on in the room Emma now occupied. He could just make out her silhouette as she leaned over the crib, laying Grace down with a tenderness that quieted the room. She moved slowly, gently, as though her entire world was resting in the crook of that small, sleeping body. He wanted to believe what his eyes saw, but in his chest, something had shifted. The messages were still there, the file still open, and suspicion, an old skill he'd long sharpened in the boardrooms of his past, had returned like a beast woken from slumber. Not with rage, but with quiet patience. It had no claws, no teeth, just questions. Just the cold breath of what if. His phone buzzed again. Not a message, a missed call. Same number, no voicemail, no second attempt. Avery didn't call back. He switched off the screen. But what stirred inside him could not be silenced. And in that quiet, watching the dim room below and the woman whose life had suddenly collided with his own, Avery understood something he had tried hard to forget. That pain from the past never truly disappears. It waits for the right moment to return, to knock on the walls of the mind, and remind a man that trust is a luxury rarely afforded to those who have once lost everything. Morning light spilled gently through the tall glass windows, casting a soft glow across the marble floors, bathing the Blackwell estate in a warmth that felt almost merciful. But Avery's thoughts remained steeped in the shadows of the night before. He hadn't slept. The messages, the photo, the court record, all of it clung to him like an invisible noose, tightening with every attempt to draw a clear breath. What little piece he had begun to rebuild now stood on the brink again. And perhaps the worst part was not the doubt itself, but the quiet dread of what would happen if he dared to ask for the truth and couldn't bear the answer. Emma was feeding Grace when he knocked. She looked up, her face weary, but still carrying that quiet grace he had come to recognize. He didn't wait for her to speak. He simply entered, standing still, silent. And she knew at once something had shifted. The air between them was no longer the same. Gone was the softness in his eyes, the thoughtful cadence of his voice. In its place was space. A door cracked open between them, and something unspoken standing just beyond the threshold. "You found my record, didn't you?" Her voice was not afraid. It carried only the resignation of someone who had long grown used to being exposed. Avery didn't answer at first. He only nodded. Emma set the bottle down and gently lifted Grace onto her shoulder before standing. She moved toward the window, letting the early sunlight wash over her face. It lit the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind that no amount of sleep could erase. "I've thought about this day," she said softly. "The day I'd have to answer to someone for what I did. I just didn't expect it to come right when I was starting to feel safe again." She paused, as though steadying herself against a memory that still hurt to touch. "I was 19 when my mother got sick. Really sick. Insurance didn't cover the treatment, and the medication was far too expensive. I was working night shifts at a convenience store, barely earning enough to eat. Then, a man who came in regularly approached me, said if I helped him with some fake returns, he'd give me money. I didn't ask questions. I just thought about my mother. We did it for 3 months. I took the money, bought her medicine, and convinced myself I was doing the right thing for my family. Then the system caught the discrepancies. He disappeared, and I was arrested." She turned to face him, eyes steady. "I pleaded guilty. I didn't fight it. I went through the rehabilitation program. When I got out, my mother had already passed. I never got to say goodbye. Since then, I've taken every job I could find. Cleaning houses, serving tables, caring for the elderly. No one wants to hire someone with a record. I know I can't erase my past. But every day since, I've done everything I can to be a good mother to Grace." Avery listened without interruption. His chest tightened under the weight of her words, not because they sought pity, but because they didn't. They were bare, honest, offered without defense. She had spoken not to earn sympathy, but because she knew he deserved to know, and because she had nothing left to protect but the fragile trust that had only just begun to take root between them. He stepped closer, his eyes drifting to the child now dozing peacefully against her mother's shoulder, her small face untouched by the storms that had raged around her. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said quietly. But I do know this: there are some truths you can't measure in court documents or whispered warnings. He paused. I'm not going to make a decision today. But Emma, I need you to understand. This isn't forgiveness. This is a moment. A space for both of us to figure out what this really is, and whether we're walking towards something that's worth holding on to. Emma nodded, not in relief, but with resolve. She wasn't hoping for acceptance. She was hoping for the chance to prove herself, because in all the mistakes she had made, and all the wrong turns that had led her here, there was one thing she knew with absolute certainty. Grace was the one thing she had done right. Avery stepped out of the room, the door closing behind him with a slow, silent weight, like the echo of a verdict delivered not by a judge, but by time itself. Emma's words still rang in his ears, woven together with the image of her standing there, cradling Grace, offering no excuses, shedding no tears, only truth laid bare and a gaze that refused to look away. He had seen eyes like that before, in those who had lost too much and had nothing left to hide. Perhaps that was why he hadn't turned away, why he couldn't handle this the way he had handled everything else in his life, with cool detachment, with logic polished like steel. Back in his study, morning light slanted through the tall windows, casting long lines across the worn wooden desk where he had sat for decades, building a life defined by structure and control. He reopened the file someone had sent him. The facts were indisputable: the charges, the sentencing, the official seal of the court. Everything in those pages spoke of a past carved in stone. And yet, no matter how many times he read them, he couldn't reconcile the woman described in those documents with the one he had spoken to just an hour ago. He closed the folder and let out a long breath. In his world, everything had a process, everything could be proven, but Benjamin had never lived by rules. And now, Grace, this child who had brought both chaos and clarity, was another reminder that some things refused to fit into neat lines and well-labeled boxes. A child who could not lie, who knew nothing of manipulation, who carried no past beyond her cries and her laughter. And if Benjamin had seen something in Emma, had trusted her, then maybe it was time Avery remembered how to see with something more than just his eyes, something he had long let go cold. Later that day, as Emma walked slowly through the garden behind the estate with Grace in her arms, Avery appeared beneath the canopy of trees. He said nothing at first, just watched her, as if searching her face for something no file could ever reveal. Then, at last, he nodded. His eyes softened. Stay. At least for now. I don't believe in coincidence, Emma, and if Benjamin could trust you, then maybe I need to learn how to take that step too, even if it's only a small one. Emma didn't speak. She looked at him, then down at Grace, who nestled against her shoulder with complete peace. In that moment, she knew she wasn't standing alone anymore. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something just as precious, the beginning of trust. And trust, however fragile, becomes the strongest thing in the hands of someone who has lost everything before. That day, Avery had begun to offer it again. He had barely returned to his office when the sharp rhythm of determined footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door hadn't fully closed behind him when it swung open forcefully. Victoria entered without knocking, without waiting. In her hand was a thick file, and on her face was a look far sterner than usual, laced with anger and something close to desperation. "You're still letting her stay?" Her voice was cold, clipped. "I thought after everything I sent you, you'd be clear-headed enough to see what this really is. A threat, a calculated lie wrapped in a convenient story." Avery said nothing. He walked to his desk, sat down, and looked at her without a word, letting the silence stretch, as if inviting her to fill it with the explanation he knew was coming. Victoria dropped the folder onto the desk. Several sheets slid free, spilling across the surface the photo of Emma at the store, the scanned court documents, her criminal record. "She has a conviction, Avery. You're really going to let someone like that live under your roof, near a child we know nothing about? You're going to take her word that she had a serious relationship with Benjamin based on nothing but an old necklace? The whole thing, it's too neat, too perfect." Avery picked up one page, glanced at it briefly, then set it back down. Victoria leaned forward, her voice lowering but thick with tension. "You're a brilliant man. I've stood by you for years. I know you better than anyone, and I know you don't act on feelings. But this is you letting emotion lead, and that will ruin everything. Not just your name, but the legacy you've spent a lifetime building." She didn't blink. Her hands were clenched, her breath tight, as if this moment mattered more than any she'd stood in before. But Avery remained still, his face unreadable. Because while Victoria had brought documents, facts, a plan, Emma had brought something else. Something that couldn't be filed or cross-examined. Something that whispered of a different kind of truth. One that didn't erase the past, but dared to ask what a person could become after it. And now, between the woman who had always lived by his side in certainty and the one who had arrived with nothing but a child and a broken story, Avery found himself at a crossroad where neither logic nor loyalty could offer an easy way forward. Avery leaned back slightly, fingers laced together, his gaze locked on Victoria's face. His voice, when it came, was calm but steady, the quiet force of a man who had spent his life making impossible decisions with nothing more than instinct and discipline. "She hasn't asked for anything." He said it slowly, deliberately. "She didn't know who I was until she stepped inside this house. She hasn't asked for money. She hasn't made demands. She only asked for a job so she could raise her child." Victoria let out a dry, bitter laugh. "And you believe that? You believe she just happened to show up here? That the child is really Benjamin's? Then where are the documents, Avery? Where is the proof? One old necklace anyone could have forged." Avery's jaw tightened, but his voice remained composed. Benjamin was private. He could have loved someone without anyone ever knowing. And if the child is his, she doesn't need a birth certificate to have a place in my heart. Victoria stepped forward, her tone hardening further, the heat behind her eyes no longer masked by civility. "Then let me speak plainly. Either you let me handle this the right way, get a DNA test, verify her identity, and if anything is off, get her out of your life, or—" She stopped, her voice lowering into something heavier. "Or I walk away, not just as your assistant, not just as your legal counsel. I walk away from all of it, and I take everything I know with me. And you know I know plenty." Avery didn't flinch. He looked her dead in the eye, unwavering. "Is that a threat?" Victoria's lips thinned. "It's a choice. You taught me that, to always know when to contain damage before it spreads. This is one of those moments." Silence fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Only the faint ticking of the old wall clock remained. Avery rose slowly and turned toward the window, his eyes drawn to the garden below, where Emma was now gently pushing Grace's stroller under the shade of the magnolia trees. The child lay still, her face serene, untouched by the turmoil unfolding behind glass and stone. He took a long breath, then turned back to Victoria. "I'll think about it." His voice was low, decisive, but Victoria heard what he wasn't saying. It wasn't agreement, it was a delay, a storm gathering behind his eyes, one she could no longer control. She said nothing more. She turned sharply and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her with a quiet finality, like the slice of a blade through already tense air. Avery didn't return to his desk. He remained by the window, watching Emma cradle Grace beneath the trees. The scene was deceptively peaceful, like a painting hung in a room full of secrets. But inside him, a storm was tightening, twisting. Victoria had crossed a line, but she wasn't a fool. She knew the numbers, the names, the gaps in contracts, the quiet favors, the legal blind spots he had once navigated so carefully. If she struck back, the cost wouldn't just be monetary. It would be ruin, the unraveling of a reputation built brick by brick over decades. And yet, that wasn't what truly troubled him. It was Emma. It was Grace. It was the echo of Benjamin's name in the middle of all of it. Because if Emma had told the truth, if this child was truly his friend's legacy, then Avery stood at the edge of the one chance he might ever have to set something right. But if Victoria was right, if all of this was manipulation, a fabrication designed to worm its way into his life, his estate, his wealth, then he was risking everything for a lie. But Avery Blackwell had never been a man to move on impulse. Every step was measured, every decision deliberate, and this would be no different. He pulled out his phone, opened his voice memo app and set it to record automatically. Then he opened a blank email draft, attached the anonymous messages, the photographs, and the court documents Victoria had provided, not as a confession, not as surrender, but as insurance. If anything happened, if someone tried to discredit him, corner him, ruin what he had built, every file, every message, every trace would be sent to the one man he trusted beyond question. Robert Quinn, an old classmate, an independent lawyer, one who had never taken a dime from the Blackwell estate, never worked within the circles Victoria had so carefully tied together. Robert had warned him before, don't trust people who have too much to lose if you fall. And for the first time, Avery knew just how right he had been. This wasn't panic. It was preparation. Because trust, when offered by someone who had once lost everything, may be powerful, but it's never blind. That evening, Avery asked the staff to prepare a light meal on the back terrace. He invited Emma to join him, using the pretense of discussing household routines and her responsibilities. When she arrived, Grace was already asleep, and she carried the quiet, watchful tension of someone waiting for a verdict they weren't sure they wanted to hear. She sat across from him, the garden lights casting a soft glow on her face, and though she said nothing, her eyes held the quiet gravity of a woman who had learned to brace for hard truths. Avery was the first to speak. "I'm in the process of rearranging a few things," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "You may hear things in the coming days. People may try to warn you or threaten you. But I want you to hear this from me. I'm not easily manipulated. And I believe the truth has its own way of defending itself, if you know how to find it." Emma nodded once, not asking what he meant. She didn't need to. She could sense that he was preparing for something bigger than her presence here. Something that would not be solved with a simple answer. Avery poured a cup of tea. His hand was steady, but his voice dropped a note lower, touched with a gravity that didn't go unnoticed. "I used to believe I could control everything. But Benjamin wasn't like me. He lived on instinct, on trust. That was something I never fully understood until he was gone. And now, standing here before his daughter, I know I can't afford to step back again." After the meal, when Emma quietly returned to her room, Avery made his way back to his office and locked the door behind him. He moved to the old safe tucked behind the bookshelf, turned the dial with practiced fingers, and retrieved a small silver USB. It held documents, yes, but also handwritten pages from Benjamin, notes Avery had kept unread for years, too raw, too close, too filled with things he wasn't ready to face. He switched on the desk lamp, its glow catching on the edges of old paper, and began turning page after page, searching for a thread, any proof, any name, any trace of Emma. And then he found it. Just a short line, scribbled in Benjamin's unmistakable hand, the ink uneven, the words simple but final. "M, she's the last good thing I did in this life." Avery froze. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a signed affidavit. But it was everything. A testimony from the one man he had trusted more than anyone. And in that quiet moment, Avery knew. This wasn't about charity. It wasn't even about Grace. It was about Benjamin. And that last good thing deserved to be defended, whatever the cost. The night deepened, and the house settled into its familiar stillness. Only the whisper of wind threading through the garden trees and the soft creak of old wood echoed along the empty corridors. But Avery remained awake, sitting at his desk with that single page resting before him. "M. She's the last good thing I did in this life." Each word seemed etched into his memory now, as though Benjamin were still in the room with him, watching silently, urging him to listen, to do better, to not get this wrong again. And Avery, for once, didn't try to reason his way out of it. He simply listened. The next morning, when Avery entered the dining room, Emma was already there, seated quietly with Grace sleeping soundly in the cradle beside her. The air between them had shifted, no longer stiff with uncertainty like it had been in the early days. Something had changed, unspoken, but deeply felt. A trust, still fragile, still forming, yet more honest than anything either of them had shared with another person in years. Avery took his seat, poured his coffee, and let his gaze linger for a moment on the soft tangle of Emma's hair, the serene little face of Grace. The child was sleeping deeply, lips slightly pursed as if dreaming of something sweet. His voice broke the silence, slow and deliberate. I want to ask you something, not out of curiosity, but because I need to understand. Did Benjamin ever speak of the future? Of you and the baby? Emma looked up. Their eyes met and held. It was a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was low, caught somewhere between memory and ache. He never made promises, not outright, but he said he was going to sort out his life. He said he wanted to start over. In a place where he could finally be himself, with someone who made that feel possible. Avery nodded. He didn't ask for more. He didn't need to. He had known Benjamin well enough to recognize the weight behind simple words. When Benjamin said things like that, it meant the decision had already been made quietly, firmly, deep in his heart. And if he had said those things to Emma, then she had already been a part of him in a way no document could ever prove. They spent the morning together, moving around the house like pieces of a quiet rhythm rediscovered, feeding Grace, preparing a simple lunch, sitting side by side in the sun-drenched living room as light poured in through tall windows. There were moments when Emma laughed as Grace grasped a large spoon instead of her feeding one. Moments when Avery bent down to pick up a dropped stuffed toy without a second thought. These little gestures, scattered and unremarkable, began to form something that didn't yet have a name. A closeness not built on obligation or blood, but on something deeper. Recognition through shared loss. Connection through scars neither had tried to hide. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Avery opened the door leading out to the garden and invited Emma to join him on the old bench beneath the canopy of trees where he and Benjamin had spent countless hours. He pointed to the empty spot beside him. He always sat there, and I sat over here. We talked about everything, business, life, love, but I never saw his eyes brighter than the last time we met. He didn't say much, but I knew he'd found something I never did. Emma didn't respond. She only sat beside him quietly, their eyes both turned toward the golden haze settling over the lawn. In that stillness, no words were needed, no digging into the past, no promises for what might come, just this moment, undisturbed, where they could acknowledge they had found each other at the exact time they were meant to, not to replace what had been lost, but to guard what remained, the last thread of someone they had both loved in their own silent, separate ways. As the sun dipped behind the western trees, casting long shadows across the garden, Avery reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't touched in years. The call rang only once before a voice, warm and deep, answered, tinged with unmistakable surprise. Avery. My God, it's been too long. I almost thought you'd vanished. Avery didn't waste time. I need someone I can trust, someone who knows the law and knows exactly how someone like Victoria plays the game. On the other end, there was a pause, then a quiet reply. Tell me what you need. Daniel Harris, attorney. Unentangled from the estate, uncompromised by old alliances, the one man Avery knew would not only understand the terrain, but would know how to strike back. What began with a whisper of doubt was about to become a deliberate, careful counterattack, not to destroy, but to protect what was left of the last good thing Benjamin Moore had left behind. The following day, Daniel arrived at the estate. Still the same neatly pressed suit, the same worn leather briefcase he had carried through decades of legal work, and the same clear, discerning eyes that missed nothing. After a firm handshake with Avery, he settled into the armchair in the study, the very room where so much had begun, and where now he would help bring it to its end. Avery handed him everything, every document Victoria had left behind, every veiled threat, the audio recording of their tense conversation that night, financial notes, subtle manipulations that suggested tampering. Daniel read carefully, not skimming a single line. He turned each page with the precision of a surgeon, eyes narrowing only when necessary, jaw tightening at the more damning sections. When he finally closed the folder, the room fell into a moment of silence. Then he looked up, steady and calm. This is targeted intimidation, he said. It qualifies as attempted extortion, and there are clear signs of unauthorized interference with personal property. With the recording, we have grounds to pursue legal action. If you want to go further, I can file for a warrant to examine her devices and financial records. One traceable payment, one forged document. This stops being civil. It becomes criminal." Avery nodded. His gaze held none of the uncertainty of a man still nursing old wounds, but the quiet steel of someone who had chosen to stand and fight for what mattered, for what remained. He told Daniel to begin immediately. Upstairs, Emma was unaware of any of it. She spent the morning with Grace, now beginning to sit up on her own, soft fingers grasping the edge of her crib. Emma moved through the house with quiet purpose, sometimes helping in the kitchen, folding linens, wiping down surfaces with the staff. Each task, however small, was her way of staying steady, of reminding herself that even if her place here was uncertain, her dignity didn't have to be. That evening, Avery invited her into the small library tucked behind the main hall. The room smelled faintly of cedar and paper. He told her everything, about contacting Daniel, about the case being prepared, about the decision to bring Victoria's tactics into the light. Emma listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at him, and her voice, though soft, trembled. "And if it doesn't go as you planned, if Victoria really has something that could hurt you?" Avery gave a small smile. It wasn't prideful or careless, but the weary, peaceful kind of smile that only comes from someone who had already known greater losses than reputation. "I've already lost a brother. I lost faith in the law years ago. There's nothing left that scares me now. But I'll be damned if I let Grace grow up in a world where the wrong people keep winning because the right people stay silent." His words carried the weight of a promise. And the next morning, Daniel filed suit with the regional court, sending a formal notice to the law firm where Victoria remained a senior associate. No threats, no headlines, just law, evidence, and the kind of justice they had all once stopped believing in. But now, something stirred, quiet but undeniable. Not the certainty of victory, just the courage to fight, the decision to no longer be quiet. A few days later, the resignation letter appeared on Avery's desk. Victoria had chosen to leave quietly rather than face the exposure of a public trial. The storm she tried to summon had simply passed over, leaving the house more peaceful than before. Emma sat by the bedroom window that morning, her eyes following the first rays of sun as they streamed through the canopy of garden leaves. Grace was still asleep, her breath steady, fingers curled around the edge of a faded cream-colored blanket. The mansion had changed since the first day Emma walked through its doors, arms full, heart heavy, afraid of everything and everyone. But now, even as the world shifted beneath her feet, she understood one thing clearly. She couldn't lean forever on Avery's kindness, not because she didn't trust him, but because one day she would have to be enough on her own, not for pride, not for proof, but because her daughter deserved a mother who could stand tall, who could stay, not because she was allowed to, but because she had earned her place in the world. That morning, Emma made her way to the study, not out of obligation, but with a quiet determination in her step. Avery was already there, seated behind his desk, eyes narrowed in concentration as he reviewed a new legal brief from Daniel. The morning light poured through the tall windows, casting long lines across the pages in his hand. When he saw her at the doorway, he looked up and smiled gently, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated for just a moment before taking the seat across from him. "There's something I want to say, and I hope you'll understand." Her voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it, of vulnerability wrapped in resolve. "I know you've done so much for Grace and me. I'm grateful for every single thing. But I don't want to be someone who's only protected. I want to do something meaningful, not just to repay you, but because I need to know I can stand on my own." Avery said nothing at first. He slowly set the documents down on the desk, folded his hands together, and looked at her not as a benefactor, but as a man who saw something of his younger self in the woman before him. "When I was your age, I believed I could do everything on my own," he said quietly. "I used to think asking for help was weakness, but life has a way of teaching us otherwise. After enough loss, I learned that some paths aren't meant to be walked alone. Not because we're not strong enough, but because walking with someone makes the journey worth something more." Emma lowered her gaze. His words struck something tender and long buried inside her. The countless nights she had cried, without reason, not from fear, but from the weight of holding it all together, the silence, the fatigue, the loneliness. But she also knew that if she didn't learn to rise on her own feet, she would always live in the shadow of her past. Avery didn't chastise her. He respected her. "So where do you want to begin?" She took a breath, steadying herself. "I studied accounting before my mother got sick, before Grace. I had to quit everything, but I've never lost the love for it. I think, if it's possible, I'd like to go back, finish what I started, get certified, find work, for real this time." Something lit in Avery's eyes. He stood, walked to a nearby bookshelf, and returned with a slim leather-bound notebook. Inside, a list of short-term programs from the local university. Flexible schedules, part-time classes. "I've thought about this for some time," he said. "These are programs that could work around your life with grace, with the responsibilities you already carry. If you agree, I'd like to help fund your tuition. Not as charity. As an investment. I see in you something many people with degrees never find: resilience, empathy, purpose." Emma's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She nodded, slowly, deeply, unable to form the words. And in that moment, the space between them was no longer defined by roles or circumstance. They were simply two people, both shaped by loss, both reaching for meaning, finding their way out of the darkness by walking side by side. Emma knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but for the first time, she wasn't alone. And more importantly, she didn't feel like someone being rescued. She felt like someone choosing a future, one built not on fear or survival, but on belief in herself and in what she could become. The small room at the end of the hallway, once a forgotten storage space in the sprawling estate, now bore a new face. The walls had been repainted in soft, calming tones. White curtains fluttered gently in the morning breeze. A study nook had been arranged with a modest desk, a shelf lined with books, and a brand-new laptop sitting quietly at the center. It was the first gift Avery gave her after her decision to return to school. There were no grand announcements, no speeches, just a quiet offering, a gesture of trust. But the real change wasn't in the furniture or the fresh coat of paint. It was in the air. In the feeling that this house, once only a place of temporary refuge, was beginning to feel like something more. A home. A place where she no longer had to hold her breath. A place where she was accepted not in spite of her past, but with it. A place where she didn't have to flinch at every sound or glance. A place where her story could begin again. And this time, on her own terms. Grace had begun to walk, her uncertain steps bringing bursts of laughter that filled the living room each morning. Her giggles, light and bright, became a familiar sound in the great halls of the Blackwell estate, echoing against old walls that had long forgotten the joy of children. Avery, often in the middle of reading documents or listening to legal updates from Daniel, would pause without hesitation to bend down and pick up a fallen teddy bear, or simply to smile as those unsteady feet wobbled across the rug. He never said much, but in the quiet gestures, the way his gaze followed her, the way his body softened in her presence, he said more than words ever could. Grace was no longer a disruption in the rhythm of his day, like she had been on that first afternoon, crying loudly in her mother's arms. She had become something else, a heartbeat, a sign that life, once so still, was moving forward again. Emma, too, was changing. She still carried worries about the future, about stability, but something in her had begun to shift. And strangely, it wasn't when she tried harder, proved more, or fought to be seen that things changed. It was when she let herself be, when she stopped hiding behind apologies and silence, stopped clutching her past like a burden she had to explain. She was no longer just the woman who came through the gate carrying a child and a story no one wanted to believe. She was a mother, a student, a woman building again from the ground up, and it showed in the way she walked, in the way she laughed, in the quiet confidence that had begun to grow where fear used to live. One afternoon, while rearranging books in the library, Emma discovered an old photo tucked between 2 volumes of business theory. It was of Avery and Benjamin in their youth, standing on a beach, wind in their hair, joy in their faces. She didn't ask about it. She simply wiped off the dust and placed it on a visible shelf where light could touch it. When Avery saw it later that evening, he said nothing for a long time, just stood there, his eyes distant. And then he nodded just once as if he'd finally allowed himself to keep something he'd spent years trying to bury. The house, once defined by its silences and its empty rooms, was filling, not just with sound, but with presence, with trust, with intention, and in that quiet transformation, both Avery and Emma understood they weren't just opening the doors of a house, they were slowly and carefully unlocking a part of themselves that had long been sealed off by loss, regret, and mistrust. The past no longer hung over them like a shadow, but instead settled into the foundation firm, known, and no longer feared. One soft spring afternoon, as the sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the living room, Grace stood on the soft rug, looking at her mother with eager eyes. Emma knelt a few steps away, arms wide open, tears already brimming before the first step was even taken. Grace's legs trembled, but then one step, then another. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Avery stood in the doorway, a folder still in his hand, but his eyes fixed solely on that small figure, moving, reaching, becoming. When Grace collapsed into her mother's arms, Emma broke, not with fear, with gratitude, with awe, with the kind of joy that only grows in the cracks left behind by suffering. For others, it might have been a milestone easily passed over, but for Emma, it was everything. It was the culmination of a journey from the young woman who once held her crying child in a stranger's house, shivering under the weight of judgment, to now watching that same child take her first steps in a home warmed by trust and sunlight and a love neither of them had dared to expect. Avery set the folder down. Quietly, he walked over and knelt beside them. He didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on Grace's back, and when she looked up, she laughed bright and open and reached for him as if to share her victory. In that moment, something long dormant in Avery stirred awake. A piece of himself he thought was gone returned, not with fanfare, but with a simple, profound presence, the laughter of a child, the warmth of skin against skin, the sense that something true had taken root again. Not long after, Avery commissioned a redesign of the back garden. A small play area was added, nothing extravagant, just a gentle space with a seesaw, a slide, and a white swing that caught the late afternoon light. No one had asked for it. No one had even mentioned it, but Avery had felt it, a need to create a place for Grace. A place untouched by the shadows of the adult world, a place where she could run, fall, laugh, and grow. Not weighed down by the past, but lifted by something new. Hope. It had taken its time, but now it was here. Not in grand gestures, but in the sound of small feet on wooden floors, in old photos placed gently on shelves, and in the softest of moments when no one was watching, but everything was being healed. One evening, after tucking Grace into bed, Emma went downstairs to make herself a cup of tea and found Avery sitting at the kitchen table, slowly turning a picture frame in his hands. It was an old photograph of him and Benjamin, taken when they were two young men in their 20s, laughing with carefree joy on a sunlit summer beach. Emma sat down across from him without saying a word. For a long while, silence lingered between them, until Avery finally spoke, his voice quiet, but steady. Benjamin once told me, sometimes we don't need to run far to find ourselves. We just need to stop long enough to let the heart speak. Emma didn't answer, but her eyes held a deep wordless understanding, because she knew that truth. She, too, was learning how to listen to herself after so many years of living in fear and shame. They sat like that, side by side, two people once broken in their own quiet ways, now finding common ground in the presence of a child. Grace had brought them together, not through blood, but through something stronger, something more enduring emotion, forgiveness, and the yearning to begin again. Emma told Avery about a dream she once had, back when life still felt like something she could shape. She had wanted to become a preschool teacher, to work with young children and teach them how to write their first letters. But then everything had unraveled. The sentence, the judgmental stares, the grief, and the loss of her mother had convinced her that dream would forever remain a fragment. Avery didn't interrupt, didn't rush to offer comfort. He simply asked gently, Then why not start again today? That question, so quiet, bloomed like a green shoot rising through dry and barren ground. Emma looked at him, and in her eyes, a faint glimmer of hope emerged. She didn't need someone to save her. She only needed someone who believed she still could rise. And Avery did that, not through promises, but through patience, through days of quiet observation, through unwavering acceptance. They both knew the road ahead would be long, filled with turns and hardships. But today, just for today, they allowed themselves to dream a little, to imagine a future where the past no longer held them captive, where every step Grace took wasn't just the journey of a growing child, but a gentle reminder that all wounds can heal when held in love and patience. On the windowsill, the silver necklace with Benjamin's name etched into the medallion lay quietly inside its small box, a silent witness to every new beginning. And somewhere, in the hush of the night, something mended itself. Neither Avery nor Emma needed to say it aloud. They both knew they were no longer alone. Avery began waking earlier each morning, not because of board meetings or endless streams of appointments like in the years before, but because of the bright, ringing laughter of Grace echoing from the far end of the hallway. He no longer drank his coffee alone on the cold balcony the way he once did. Instead, each morning now held the soft murmur of Emma coaxing the child to eat, the smell of fresh bread from the oven, the quiet sounds of life slowly weaving themselves into every corner of a house that had once been too silent to bear. That house had once been his refuge, a fortress where he hid from the pain of losing his closest friend, from the loss of trust in others and in himself. But now it was becoming something different, a home, a place where he was not only living, but learning to love again. No one had asked him to change, but Grace, in her own quiet way, had reached into the deepest part of him, the part he thought was gone forever. Emma could feel it too. She didn't know exactly when it happened, but something in the way Avery looked at her had changed. It was no longer just the quiet sympathy of someone who had lived through enough sorrow to recognize it in others. Sometimes he simply watched her in the kitchen as she studied with flour on her hands or read fairy tales to Grace before bed. It was a look that said nothing out loud, but carried warmth. It did not demand. It did not expect. She knew Avery had once loved, had once lost, and had closed the doors of his heart after Benjamin's tragedy. But Emma was not someone from his past. She wasn't here to replace memories or to fill the empty spaces that remained. She was simply here, sincere and strong enough not to ask for anything, not to hope for anything. And that, more than anything, allowed her to slowly walk into his life in the most natural way. One quiet afternoon, Emma returned from the library with Grace, their arms full of picture books and study materials, and found Avery in the garden planting flowers. He was bent over, his hands caked with soil, yet every gesture was deliberate, adjusting the space between each root with an unusual care. Emma, surprised, asked why he was doing it himself when he could easily hire someone to take care of it. Avery simply smiled, saying nothing right away. It wasn't until the three of them were sitting together on the stone steps of the porch that he finally spoke, his voice calm and reflective. When you put your hands in the earth, you feel truly alive. It's as if all the masks come off and there's nothing left but your truest self. It's been a long time since I felt like just a man, not a boss, not the one carrying the weight of an entire empire, just someone who can sit next to a child, plant a flower, and laugh at the simple things. Emma didn't reply. She looked at him for a long moment, a wave of unfamiliar emotion rising within her. It wasn't the heady kind of love wrapped in romance and daydreams. It was understanding, it was gratitude, it was respect. But more than that, it was a sense of safety she hadn't felt since losing her mother, since losing Benjamin, since carrying the burden of her past like a shadow. With Avery, she didn't have to hide or pretend she was fine. She was allowed to be herself, a mother, a student, a woman quietly rebuilding her life from the ruins. That night, after Grace had drifted to sleep, Emma went down to the kitchen to get some water and found Avery still awake. He was reading through the first draft of her learning program, the one she had submitted as part of her application for an internal scholarship at the local school. Without saying much, he reached over and placed his hand lightly on hers, leaving it there for a moment. Their eyes met, and no words were necessary. In that silent moment, Emma understood that they were no longer just two strangers carrying their own pain. They had become a family, not by blood, not through any formal title, but through grace, through countless quiet afternoons shared, through a deep, unconditional understanding that had grown between them in its own quiet, unspoken way. Avery had never imagined he would rebuild a life at this stage in his years. But he came to see that nothing is ever truly too late if the heart still knows how to feel, if we're still willing to open ourselves. Emma had never dared to dream that after all her wounds, she could find something like family again. Not in the traditional sense, but in a way that felt deeper and more real. An old man, a new heart, and a family that looked different, but held all the love she had ever longed for. They didn't need anyone else to acknowledge it, because they knew, as long as they had each other, it was enough. One early summer morning, sunlight bathed the porch in golden warmth. Emma opened the window in Grace's room, letting in the soft breeze scented with freshly cut grass and the sweet aroma of jasmine from the back garden. She looked over at her daughter, still sound asleep. Her small arms wrapped around the beige teddy bear Avery had bought the first time she ever smiled at him. The little room had slowly filled with children's books, crayon drawings, scattered toys, and photographs of the three of them captured in everyday moments. None of the pictures were staged or taken out of obligation. They were quiet, candid memories, preserving not only the growing up of a child, but the gentle revival of two once broken souls. Emma had submitted her application to the early childhood education program at the city's community college. As she filled in the final fields, she paused for a long time at the section labeled Emergency Contact. In the past, she'd had no one, but this time, her hand didn't tremble as she wrote down Avery's name. That name wasn't just a point of contact. It was a quiet admission that, at last, she had someone she could lean on. Avery didn't ask questions, didn't say anything when she handed him the form to sign, but his eyes softened in a way that said more than words ever could. It was the look of quiet pride, not because she needed him, but because she had chosen him to walk alongside her in this journey. 1 week later, Avery went to the bank and quietly established a trust fund under the name Grace Evelyn Moore. The terms were clear, ensuring financial security for her education and her future until adulthood. But it wasn't the amount that brought tears to Emma's eyes. It was the letter, handwritten and folded into the envelope along with the legal documents. In it, Avery wrote to Grace as if she were already old enough to understand. He told her she was a gift that fate had placed in his life at a time when he had believed his story was already over. He wrote that if, one day, she grew up and found herself doubting who she was or questioning the world around her, she should remember that once she made a dried-up old man learn how to laugh again. And he believed, with quiet certainty, that she would one day soften the world, just as she had softened him. Emma read the letter alone after Grace had gone to sleep. She cried, not from sadness, but because her heart was filled with a feeling she once believed only existed in fairy tales. Somewhere deep in her soul, she still carried the fear that all good things were fleeting. But Avery's steady presence, from the smallest things like keeping tissues tucked in his coat pocket to the way he would sit in silence and listen to her talk through her quiet worries, had slowly dismantled the walls she had spent years building around herself. She no longer saw him as a man from a world too far removed from her own. He had become her companion, her quiet mentor, the man who stood behind her as she learned to stand on her own. They didn't speak of the future with grand promises or poetic vows, but every action, every quiet choice was laying the foundation for something lasting. On a Sunday morning, the three of them sat together in the garden. Grace chased soap bubbles across the lawn. Emma clipped flowers into a bowl of water, and Avery read a book beneath the shade. A neighbor passing by on the other side of the white wooden fence paused, smiled gently, and said they looked like a real family. Avery looked up, the sunlight catching the silver in his hair, making it gleam like a thread of time. He didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, a quiet gesture of agreement. Then he turned to Emma, then to Grace. He didn't need to say anything more. because in his heart that's exactly what they were. To Avery, love no longer looked like the loud, fervent fire of youth. It was presence. It was trust given without condition. It was the quiet willingness to step back so someone else could move forward. To Emma, the future no longer felt like a distant, unreachable dream. It was lived day by day with intention, with the quiet belief that she was doing the right thing. And for Grace, that future was being built with each small step, each gentle glance, each warm embrace wrapped around her like a shelter. None of them were perfect, but each of them was trying to become a better version of themselves, and sometimes that was enough. Enough to begin writing a new chapter, one built entirely on love and trust. The last month of summer passed softly, like an instrumental melody played low and slow. In the house that had once felt cold and hollow, mornings now began with the sound of feet on wooden floors, with Grace's giggles as Emma tied her hair off center, with the quiet exchange of words between two adults in a kitchen scented with herbal tea. Life was no longer a string of lonely days. It had become a collection of shared moments, of glances that held meaning. None of the three had started from a perfect place. Emma had carried the shame of a youthful mistake. Avery had lost all faith after the death of his closest friend. Grace had been born into sorrow that didn't yet have a name. And yet, somehow, they had found one another and built a home from what remained after the storms. There was no certificate to say they were a family. But in every small gesture, in every glance filled with knowing, in every hand resting on a shoulder when silence was needed, there was proof. They were a family because they chose to stay. Even when the past gave them reasons to leave, they chose one another. And that was enough. Emma is now a first-year college student, balancing her studies with a part-time job as a teaching assistant at an early childhood education center. The first person she told when she received a full scholarship was Avery. He stood up, pulled her into a quiet, steady embrace, and said nothing at all. But in his eyes was a trust so complete, a belief that she had not simply escaped her past, but had risen above it, using its weight to build a foundation for the life she now walks forward into. Grace, still her bright, inquisitive self, continues to fill their days with questions about everything she sees. One day she looked at Avery and asked if he was her grandfather. Avery paused, then replied gently, "I'm not your grandfather, but if you want me to be, I can be anyone you need." That single sentence held Emma still for a long moment, because she understood then, as deeply as anyone can, that family doesn't always begin with blood. It begins with choice, with acceptance, with love that asks for nothing in return. And that may be the greatest lesson this journey had given all of them. The story of Avery, Emma, and Grace is a quiet reminder that sometimes family isn't where we're born. It's where our hearts decide to stay. It's made up of the people who choose to love again, even after being hurt, who choose to trust again, even after being betrayed, who choose to rebuild, even after losing everything. Sometimes the most extraordinary thing doesn't come from something grand, but from someone choosing to stay with you when you feel like you have nothing left. Family is what we hold on to, even when everything else may change. If this story has touched something in your heart, we invite you to leave a comment below and share the part that spoke most deeply to you. Was there something in Avery and Emma's journey that reminded you of your own life? We would love to hear your honest thoughts, shared from the heart. And don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Echoes to continue walking with us through stories that are tender, soulful, and full of quiet inspiration. If you loved this video, give it a like and share it with someone you think could use a little warmth in the middle of life's noise. Thank you for spending these moments with us. We wish you health, peace, and joy in the days to come. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next story.